Welcome to the 15th of July edition of PHDQs. Mr. Speaker, this morning I was conducting marine assurance activities on behalf of my employer, and I will be conducting further such activities this afternoon. I've already learned a lesson this morning, Mr. Speaker, and it is to be precise when inviting these questions. I obviously intended for it to be about independence, politics, etc., but Mr. Speaker, I have to thank my former colleague Colin McLennan for this diamond of a question. Question 1. What noises do giraffes make? Well, Mr. Speaker and Colin, I'm happy to report that they hum to each other. Given their height and the acoustic range that they hum in, it's hardly surprising that we never hear it, but they hum. Thanks again, Colin. Moving swiftly on. Question 2. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was sent anonymously to my email address, and it was hard to find a question in all the abuse and expletives. Apparently, Mr. Speaker, I am the son of 1,000 fathers, all of them bastards like me. The general thrust of the question is, why do I hate English people so much? Well, that's an easy one. I don't. Regretfully, Mr. Speaker, I must report that most of the wallopers I know are in fact Scottish, and I've known most of them all of my life. If I'm trying to draw some nuance from the question, Mr. Speaker, it would be a generalisation that I am an Anglophobe because I want independence for Scotland. Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I'm not. England is a great country, Mr. Speaker, with by and large lovely people, as are Scotland, Wales and Ireland. If one is fortunate enough, when you combine a few things, Mr. Speaker, you end up with something which is more than just the sum of its parts. But the United Kingdom isn't like that, Mr. Speaker. It's actually less than the sum of its parts. Scotland and Wales are outward-looking nations, Mr. Speaker. The unique arrangement in Northern Ireland leaves me unsure of where they really lie. England, I believe, is no longer outward-looking, but it is sadly the largest partner in the UK and currently able to assert its political will over us. Mr. Speaker, I believe that Scottish independence will actually be a benefit to all four nations of the United Kingdom. Firstly, because all of the effort which currently goes into constitutional wrangling will no longer be needed, Mr. Speaker. I believe, if we left, that Wales would soon follow suit, but again, not sure about Northern Ireland. England, Wales and Scotland would then be able to become more like the nations they want to be, Mr. Speaker. Instead of all this infighting, we'd be able to complement each other while going our own way. England, Mr. Speaker, could have a land border with the EU, maybe even two, but those land borders would not be so easily accessible by the illegal immigration that is a perceived problem at the moment. Mr. Speaker, Scotland could rid itself of nuclear weapons and explore an appetite to rejoin Europe, if that's what our electorate really wanted. I suppose the puzzling thing, Mr. Speaker, is why does Boris Johnson object to it so much? If he were to think about it for a moment, Mr. Speaker, give us a referendum, and we decided to leave, it would cost Mr. Johnson 6 Scottish Tory MPs. But he'd get rid of 48 SNP MPs, 4 Lib Dems, and 1 Labour MP. He'd increase his majority in Westminster by 47 MPs, and probably be PM for the next 20 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think everybody wins in the event of Scottish independence, including Mr. Johnson, and not just Scotland. So, Mr. Speaker, I am not an Anglophobe. I don't hate England or her people. I just don't like the concept of the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not alone. Question 3. Mr. Speaker, Jim, not his real name, has asked why the SNP aren't working with the new list parties and strategising for a vote split to secure an Indie majority. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid to have to inform Jim that if it was as easy as that, we would have done it before. Mr. Speaker, I'm a party activist and member, and on the record right now I'm saying both votes SNP. As I'm sure you know, Mr. Speaker, it's actually against Electoral Commission regulations for a political party to advocate voters vote for another party in any circumstance. Mr. Speaker, we could find ourselves and the list party in court if it was even attempted. Tactical voting, i.e. the SNP encouraging traditional Lib Dem or Labour voters to vote for us to keep the Tories out, is permissible. And I did plenty of that during the general election, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, vote splitting in the manner described, if promoted by either party, crosses the legal line between tactical voting and election rigging. The SNP are a large and relatively experienced political party, Mr. Speaker, and we will never say anything that could get us in legal trouble or mean any results we achieve are open to legal challenge. Mr. Speaker, I hope the new list parties will hopefully follow suit and not explicitly advise people to vote for us in the constituency vote. Indie groups, which are not political parties, could promote vote splitting, and Mr. Speaker, many already are, the key difference being that they are not political parties. I've seen online chats on this get pretty nasty, Mr. Speaker, between people preaching the party gospel and people advocating vote splitting. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't put it past unionists to infiltrate these discussions and try to agitate division. So, Mr. Speaker, within the movement, we need some understanding. Party members cannot promote vote splitting. The non-party indie movement can. Mr. Speaker, any discussion on this issue should understand the 2 points above and be verbal only. Nothing typed, nothing that can be screenshotted, recorded and used against the movement. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, when you enter the voting booth, you do it alone. No one is looking over your shoulder when you put your cross in the box. Being a party member comes with responsibility, Mr. Speaker. With that in mind, this is the one and only time I will discuss this on this page. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that you and the wider indie movement will all understand why, and to clarify, once more, Mr. Speaker, I am advocating both votes SNP. Question 4 comes from my old friend Mark Magruder, Mr. Speaker. He asks why Sir Keir Starmer stopped the inquiry into the Jimmy Savile abuse scandal whilst he was alive. Well, sadly, but unsurprisingly, Mr. Speaker, I was unable to get Sir Keir on the phone. But, Mr. Speaker, I've done a fair bit of investigation in my career so far. The one thing I know is, if you're going to catch someone doing something wrong, you need incontrovertible evidence, or you need to catch them actually doing it, Mr. Speaker. We all abhor child abuse, and the crimes that Jimmy Savile is accused of, Mr. Speaker. Famously, John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, claimed that he knew Savile was a wrong'un and was open and public about his disdain for him. But, Mr. Speaker, in a court of law, none of that would have mattered. I'm a health and safety professional with some investigation skills, and, Mr. Speaker, even I know that Lydon's hunch or any similar takes on the evidence that would not stand up in court. Mr. Speaker, even I know the difference between conclusive evidence and shaky evidence. Keir Starmer is a lawyer, QC, and was Director of the Crown Prosecution Service, Mr. Speaker. So it's fair to say he has a far greater understanding of jurisprudence than the average bear. He was also not a serving politician at that time. Mr. Speaker, he would have had much more evidence to hand than any of us have ever seen. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, that if Mr. Starmer was confident of a conviction, he would have pursued it. I'm also sure, Mr. Speaker, having seen many of the documentaries and read many articles about Savile, that a failed prosecution would have just emboldened him, made him feel untouchable, and perhaps led to further abuses. The people who let Jimmy Savile get away with it, Mr. Speaker, are those who knew of his behaviour for decades and didn't come forward, or those who allegedly assisted him in covering his tracks. I'm not talking about the victims here, Mr. Speaker, but fellow celebrities, friends, etc., who all had questions. They could have spoken up. They could have stopped further suffering, Mr. Speaker. All Keir Starmer could have done, if he had the evidence, was punish him for it. Whilst we're on this subject, Mr. Speaker, I want to debunk a couple of myths about Sir Keir Starmer. The first is that by being knighted, he is somehow a stealth Tory or part of the establishment. Well, Mr. Speaker, he does in fact come from a very ordinary background. I'm quite happy with him leading Labour. He's definitely more forensic in his questioning style than Jeremy Corbyn was, and I think he does a better job of showing the Tories up for what they really are, Mr. Speaker. It's also worth keeping in mind, Mr. Speaker, that he's not our problem. Boris Johnson is. Despite looking like an incompetent buffoon during this crisis, the polls still have the Tories anywhere between 5 and 10 points ahead of Labour, Mr. Speaker. I'd even speculate, Mr. Speaker, that all these attacks on Sir Keir Starmer may even be started by Tory or English nationalist groups, posing as injured lefties. And if we join in, we're only playing into their hands, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's it for PHDQs this week. I'd direct the watching public to comment, but of course, as previously warned, play nicely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.